This week's topic is local storage. You can store anything from simple settings on your app to something as complicated as a database. So when you think of what you need to store, think of in terms of complexity. If you need to store something simple like a setting for your app, or like a username or password. I wouldn't necessarily save passwords on your app, it's not very secure. But simple things, you could use local storage. Local storage, by the way, is built into HTML5. Basically, it uses the browsers. It writes a file to the browser to store values to variables and such. If you need to create something complicated, like a list of things, definitely a database is the way to go. And that is not handled by the browser, but by the app itself. Or when you're creating a database, you need to run it through something like Xcode, or so the data is stored on the application level, or in terms of the simulator level. So first off, local storage is handled natively by PhoneGap, so you don't need to install a plugin. So let's go ahead and start. So this is the basic HTML setup. HTML5. Let's see here. Here's our PhoneGap script, our PhoneGap CSS, jQuery mobile, and our JavaScript. We're going to create a form to capture the user's, let's say, email and username, and we'll store that. We'll use local storage. I'll just create a function called submit form. On our page one of our jQuery mobile, we'll create a form. So let's just get in. So we've done this before in our assignments and whatnot. Form, we don't need an action. The action is going to be handled by the JavaScript. Method post, and we'll create our onSubmit JavaScript function, and we'll call this submit form. Return submit form. Okay, so there's our form. Let's create an input name, call it username, type text. Now let's create a label for it. Label. Label. Username. And we'll create another one for password. Oh, let's not keep password. It's not very secure, like I said. Don't store passwords unless you're validating it against a web database, a secure encrypted web database. Email, username, email, text, and just finally a submit button. Submit value submit. Okay, There's our form. We could test it on the browser to see. So you can see. Let's shrink it down for a mobile sort of look. Here's our form. Submitting would do nothing, obviously. We can move the labels, username and email into the text input field, like with certain devices. So we need to hide the label with jQuery mobile class called UI hidden accessible, and then we need to create in the input we place a placeholder inside the field. So this is what actually is the label inside the text input field. So technically we don't really need the labels. We'll take this out for email. We can place a placeholder instead of the label. So this could be email. So as you can see, the label now is inside the text field. When you type, it goes away. Makes it a little bit more compact and neater. Okay. All right. So when we submit the form, we call this function. We want to automatically return false since this isn't going to a server. It's just going to a script. Since we're using jQuery, we'll use the jQuery method of grabbing the value of the input text instead of going through get element by ID. Grab the value by like so. So now we need the selector to choose the input field. Obviously we can label these input field with an ID, but we can grab it by name just to make things more compact. Square bracket. Notice I'm using single quotes to surround name equals username, since this is using double quotes. If you use double quotes, the browser will get confused and will error out because it doesn't know what's what, basically. So be careful when using single quotes and double quotes together. So I just grab the value of username. I'll stuff that into a variable. Just call it uname equal. And I'll do the same for the email. And grab the name that is email. And grab the value. So to save the value of these two variables, we can do window dot local storage dot set item. So as you can see, there's two parameters inside. One is key and the other is value. Key is basically the name of the variable that you want to use. I'll just call it username. This is going to be saved. And the value is uname. Okay. Another way to write this is window. Since this is JavaScript, we can use the square bracket. If you can remember, square bracket basically is a way to define arrays in JavaScript. So this is defining as an associative array, meaning an array that uses names instead of a number index, like 0 through whatever. So we're creating a variable called email and just setting it equal to this variable up here, which is email. Might get confusing, so I'll put an underscore in front so you can see. So we'll have it slide to page 2 when the information has been saved. And we'll write, we've seen this before, the mobile change page function to page 2, reverse false, translation or transition slide. We'll create a an output div in the content class. Actually, let's make an ID. Let's call it output. So we can write our HTML in here. We could write it straight to here. It's not a big deal. Okay, so we have our output div. So then we'll use jQuery output HTML, and we'll write username, and we'll grab the local storage. Obviously it's window dot local storage. We could use the get item function, username, let's add a break in line, BR, and we'll show the email as well. Window local storage, or like before, we can use the square bracket email to grab the value. Okay, and then close off the parentheses and semicolon. So local storage is permanent. You can call it whenever you want throughout the life of the application. There's something called session storage as well. You can use that. That's just through the life of the application being on or off. Local storage lasts longer as long as you don't uninstall it off your device. Whoops, there's an error in my JavaScript code. The quotes go outside. The quote goes outside the square bracket. It's getting JavaScript error or jQuery error. This is double quote. Okay, that should work. Here's my output. Okay. So as you can see, it printed, but then it switched back to page 1 for some odd reason. And it turned out that we do need to turn off the Ajax for the form. For some reason, the Ajax brought it back to page 1. So to do that, in your form tag, add data ajax equals false, turning off the ajax to the form, and that should stop that. Okay, so it goes to page 2. Here's my username and password. It's pretty easy. The hardest part to this is debugging. You'll find later on, especially when we get into database, debugging JavaScript in Xcode or in the Android IDE, it's going to be a little bit of a problem, especially in Xcode. So just to keep in mind, be careful, double check your spelling, syntax error. That's usually the problem. Okay, so the next step is to do database. And we can't do that in Dreamweaver or any HTML editor. We have to do that in Xcode or in the Android IDE. The next step is putting a database onto our device. So this particular database example has 3 columns: a title column, an image column, a description column. If you need a list of these things, you would add rows. You would add rows to the database. So for instance, title cat. For our example, we'll be using the URI or the URL of an image. You don't actually store the image in the database, but you store the name, the directory name. So for instance, like /images/cat.jpg and so on. So description, blue and gray. So that's how basically what a database is. It's rows and columns of information. They can either be text or numbers. On your mobile device, it uses something called SQLite, basically a smaller, compact version of SQL. Obviously not as robust as a web database, but it can do basically the same things that web database can do, but on a sort of individual mobile device. So this is Xcode, and this is our HTML5 document. Basic format as before. Page 1 and page 2. Oh, just a note on the pages. If you want to, let's say, transition to another page, and it's not in the HTML document, but on a separate HTML document, it would look something like this. Okay, so transition off to another page is not a typical HTML page. As you can see, there's no HTML tag, header. What jQuery Mobile does is it basically just looks for a div tag with a page role and insert it into the document using Ajax, of course. And if you need if you need scripts, you would add it inside the page div, and so on. So that's what it should look like. Okay, back to our HTML. Like our Excel spreadsheet, we'll create 3 columns of title, image, and description. And the first page, we'll just create a form, just like before. We placed in our form of title, image, and description. So on submit, we'll call that JavaScript function. And here we do our query into the database. But first we need to create the database. We need to create the database inside an on-device ready function. So basically it needs to wait till the device is ready, then create the database. Here's our event listener. And we need to create our on-device function. Let me break this down for you. So we create a variable called DB, for short for database, and it's a window.open database. And the first parameter that goes in, the first parameter is the name of the database. It could be anything. In this case, it's database. Second is the version. This could be any number if you like. And this is the display name. I'm not sure why you need two, but display name and the name. And lastly, the size of the database. This represents 2 megabytes, 2 times 1024 times 1024. So this is 2K, and this is 2 megs. And lastly, the transaction. So you call it transaction method. Basically, it's a in-between handler PhoneGap has that creates the database and reports any error and successes. Okay. And one quick thing about the variable db. I'm going to globalize this function. I'll explain that in a minute. So basically what I'm going to do is take the definition of the variable and put it outside the function, and inside it will be just plain db. What this does is it makes it global, meaning that I can reuse this object that's assigned to this variable anywhere in the code. When you define, let's say, when you define it inside this function, this variable is local to this function. So I can't use it, let's say, in the submit form. Let's comment this out. I will get an error if I try to do something. I will get an error or a null if I try to use this db function or this db object inside another function. So to solve that issue is to make it global by pulling it out of the context of a function and putting it outside everything, and now it becomes a global variable, so I can reuse it in other functions. So that's the premise of global versus local variables. Okay, so that's that. Now we need to create these 3 functions on the transaction. Okay, so creating the variable, reporting errors, and what to do when it's completed its task of creating a database. First, we need to create the createDB function. So whenever you create a database, an object of the transaction is passed into the function. Right now it's called tx for transaction. Could be anything you like. So then with the transaction object, you can call execute SQL method and pass in strings. And these are SQL language commands. So the first one is drop table if exists demo. We're going to name our table. The database is not the columns and rows that we talked about. It's the actual table that is the row and column. So basically we need to create a table inside a database. So the table we're going to name demo. What this first statement does is So it basically drops or deletes a table that is called demo every time you run the application. If you don't want to do that, obviously you need to comment this out. It doesn't delete the table every time you run the app. But for our purpose right now, we are going to delete it every time, so we could see how the data updates. So, and then the next statement is create the table if it doesn't exist, and you will define the columns to your table. Right now I'm adding a unique ID in the first column, title, image, and description. Just to let you know, for those of you who know about databases, you can add primary keys. Like you can call ID primary key, and I believe they automatically auto increment, so don't worry about adding that. But for our example, we don't need this. We'll just, for the sake of clarity, we'll just use title, image, and description. Okay, so that's our create our database. And next we'll create our error function. In case something goes wrong, this function gets called. So here's our error function. An error code or an error object will be passed to by the transaction every time there's an error. So we'll just alert, and then it will alert out the code of the error. Simple as that. And we'll create the success. So for our example, success won't do anything except alert a message. That it performed. So that's that. Not too bad. Now for the hard part. On our submit form function, we'll call it a DB transaction, and we'll call a function called insert DB. So basically what this function will do is grab all the values from the form inputs and then stuff it into the database and output any error if you see it. So we create an insert DB function. Remember, like before, any transaction gets passed the transaction object into the function. We'll use jQuery to grab our title, image, and description. And we'll create our SQL statement. Insert into demo, which is our table. And these are our title, image, description columns, the name of the columns, and the values. For now, we'll put in question marks. Basically, this is just a placeholder for these variables we're going to stuff in. So tx execute XML again. The first parameter is the SQL statement that we wrote up here, right? The second parameter is an array, a JavaScript array and then this is where we stuff in our variable title, image, and description. Title, image, description. Basically, this will go into those question mark placeholders. Okay. Notice the order. The order has to be exactly the same as your database table setup. So if you switch them around, you get unexpected surprises. So keep them in order. Title, image, description. And the second parameter is, the third parameter is the success function and the error. On this, the success one, I'm going to use another function. I'm not going to reuse this alerting yay. that belong to creating the database. I'm going to use it to transition to page 2 and populate a list of the information we've added. So that's basically it. So the function we need to define now is successQueryDB. So here's our successQueryDB function. Notice I'm using alert a lot just to when I debug. This is the only downside to this whole phonegap thing, is debugging is a pain. Whenever you can program in something like Dreamweaver and use the browser to debug, when you get into something like Xcode or the Android IDE, it's going to be a lot harder. A lot of these JavaScript debugging tool is not there, so I use alert a lot. I think in the Android one you can use console.log, and that would still work, maybe. But Xcode, that definitely does not work. So I use alert a lot to pop up images, pop up alerts and errors and whatnot. Okay, so in our successQueryDB, we execute another SQL, and this time instead of inserting into the table demo, we're going to select everything and then placing it in a list. So basically the syntax is select all or star from demo. I'll provide a link to all the SQL language definitions. It's not too hard, but it gets a little, there is a lot to learn, even though it's not really hard. So for instance, instead of selecting all, you just want to select the image or the title, let's say. So that's how you would do it. Select all title from demo and so on. So with this, you just select all. Okay. And the next parameter is just an array. Leave it blank or just take it out altogether. And the next one, like before, is the success function and the error function. Okay, so actually we'll rename this to something more appropriate. Let's say render list. So this will draw out our list on page 2. Okay, so function rendered list. Again, the TX object, the transaction object, is being passed. But there's also another, since we're doing select, there's another one called result. So there's two parameters. Basically what it is the result of selecting all the rows from the table demo. And this is where we'll render out the list. So the first line is basically get the number of rows in the results. So you do results.row.length, like in JavaScript. Length is a function that gets a number of objects in a list. Actually, we'll create a HTML string that will store all of our results, and then we'll print it to a div tag later on. So then here's our familiar for loop. It will perform some task until the end of the number of rows in the database. So basically what it is the HTML string plus equals, keep on adding to, instead of assigning, we're adding to. We'll create a list, like an ordered list or unordered list. In jQuery Mobile, that's a list view. And the result is basically the results row, the item. This goes through each row, and we'll get the title from this table. and then we'll end it with a closing list tag. Actually, I'm going to also add the description as well. We'll leave the image out for now, so I'll just do a break line, BR. And we'll do in addition to title, we'll do description as well. Okay, so that's it. So when that's done, actually in page 2, instead of or in addition to the output div, we'll just create a unordered list. This ID is, let's name it list view. Basically, we'll be printing the list items into this. We will select the list view ID and adding HTML to it, which is the HTML string. And we will actually need to refresh the list view. It's a jQuery mobile function called list view refresh. Without it, you'll just get a blank list view. Alright, so those are all the functions you need to run it. And for the final, oh, there's one thing we need to do. We need to change the page to page 2. So in our submit form, after we finish creating all the database and all that good stuff, we need to transition to page 2. Okay, that should be it. Let's run it in the simulator. It's the only place you can test the database. This is my index page. I have some handy links here that I can go to. So here's our SQL page. On success, it printed out yay. So now here we could enter in our title, image /cat. Obviously, with the image thing, you need to I plan to add like a camera function, that when you take the photo, the image is saved to the device, and then you can grab the URL of the image and then place it in here. I'll cover that next week with the file and camera and file integration. So here I'm just manually typing in the URL. I hit submit. Page 2 is empty. So there's some error that I can't find. I'll use my handy alert. Let's just see if anything arrived. I'll put this after. Len. Rendered called. So the debugging process here is quite a bit of a pain. This is the only way I can do it. Storage got called, or rendered got called, and there's one item, but it's not rendered. So from that, we know that this function is called, but the problem is it's not being rendered. Oh, the error processing 0. This is the error message from the database. I see that once in a while. It is a little buggy sometimes. I'm gonna comment out dropping the table. It's not the problem, but so basically I was afraid the table got destroyed and it's not pulling the information. So there you go. View. As an ID. It's got to be the strangest. Let's call it result list. Since list view is a sort of a keyword in jQuery mobile, maybe try not to use it. Result list, list view, refresh. And comment that out. Yep, there it is. Interesting. Basically, don't name it. Don't name your custom IDs the same as the jQuery mobile keywords. So there you go. The list of all the entries I made. Last two being blank because I skipped the process. That's a bit of a debugging nightmare. So in addition to the title, I'm going to add to the description run it again. Ooh, description is null. No, 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 no. See my form. Ah, there it is. I knew it. Description was improperly named, so it grabbed a null, basically, and stuffed it in. Okay, so that's the problem. We solved it. Everything's working out great. And that is the end of database.